Okay, so the next project is the high resolution project. And for this, we're going to do three different types of images. But before I jump into what those will look at, I want to talk a little bit about why we might do this in the future, why this is something that's important to know. So first of all, you may want to photograph something that is wider than your lens on your camera will allow. Uh, Stitching together multiple images will essentially give you a wider angle of view. Or perhaps you can't get far enough away from a subject. So same idea relatively, it gives you a wider angle of view if you can't back away from your subject. Or if you want a higher resolution image that you could print larger. And that's relatively my reason for doing this project is in order to do some large prints. There's a few things you want to keep in mind when you're doing this, things that you need to sort of keep locked down. And relatively, this is all so that the images will appear the same and easily be found. The edges will be able to be found to be stitched together. The way that Photoshop works is you need some overlap of what you have in your frames in order for it to find the same sort of pixels in each photo and align them. So it's really great because you don't have to manually align these things, but you have to make sure that Photoshop can easily do that. So you want your camera as stable as possible on a tripod. That works really, or is really important for the first and third method. The second method is actually meant to make it easy to handhold, but you want to keep everything else relatively locked down. So putting your camera on manual exposure, setting your white balance before you take a picture, auto white balance or custom white balance. You want to use one focal length of your lens. I would literally take a piece of tape and tape it at whatever zoom I have, or I start with. Manual focus, switching the lens to actual manual focus and taping that into place so that it doesn't change at all. And then having a consistent ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. So there isn't any noise changing between frames, any depth of field changing between frames, or relatively any change in what's moving, motion in your frames. So all manual exposure. And then for most of these, having a small aperture, more depth of field is going to make it easier to have things sharp and lined up. The second method, the Brennheiser method, you actually are intentionally creating a shallow depth of field. So that would obviously not be what you'd want to do there. So basically locking all those things down and then thinking about our hyperfocal distance if you're doing like architecture or landscape. And if you don't remember from like a photo one class, hyperfocal distance is the nearest that you can focus and still have infinity in focus. So that's really great for keeping everything sharp in a landscape photo. The other thing that you should keep in mind is whether you want to have things that are, this is popping up. Kill that. There we go. The other thing that you want to keep in mind is having everything perfectly aligned, meaning using a spirit level on your tripod when you're setting it up. So you're adjusting each leg to be the right length in order to have the camera actually level. So if you're panning left to right, you don't start shifting downward as you pan, but also using either an internal level or if you have one, a tripod mount level to make sure that you are perfectly horizontal, or suppose if you flip your orientation to have a vertical frame on the tripod for this first one particularly, that everything is perfectly level on that method too, or that way. And then keeping moving objects and lighting in mind so that you don't have anything dramatically changing between frames. If you did any of these with auto exposure and you were, say, indoors, your exposures will be all over the place because as you point towards a light, you're going to have, like the walls be much, what I'm trying to say, that you're exposing much darker. And so if you have a white wall, for example, as you're moving around a room, the blocks are going to change. Each photo is going to be brighter and darker. So set everything to manual, lock it all down so that nothing changes. Okay, so here's the three methods. The first method is kind of like a panoramic, except we don't just shoot one row of images. We want to have two or three. The second method, and I should say all of these, you need to have 20 or 30% overlap. And the first method, you'd want to have somewhere between 10 and 20 images. The second method is meant for portraiture, the Brennheiser method, and it's all the whole idea is having a shallow depth of field. And then the third method is actually using view camera, which is a piece of equipment that will allow us to, one, have a higher resolution lens, two, we can manipulate the perspective, and we can manipulate the plane of focus. And it's a bracket that goes on the back of this camera that's meant for shooting film. So the first method looks something like this. This is just the train station I always go to photograph. Now I'm going to say, do better than me, because my final composition, which is this at the bottom, is really bad. I'm cutting off the top of the roof. There's way too much roadway in the foreground. And I feel like there's more to the left or right that I'm kind of cutting off the building and missing out on. But just for example purposes, I'm zooming in and taking these 12 different frames of the building. And then I go into Photoshop and it merges them into one. Okay. Another example is a landscape photo in here, and this is just looking at them in Bridge here. And I only have 8 images in this one. Obviously, you want to have more, between 10 and 20. But Photoshop will take these and it'll stitch them together to look something like this. Now, note that depending on what method I choose to merge them together in Photoshop, I may end up with this sort of curvature at the bottom, which, depending on what you're doing, is fine. And we would just crop this off, so we wouldn't have any of that lack of information, the checker pattern behind this. So focus on finding something interesting to photograph, and make sure that you photograph enough images to really get a full interesting composition. Okay. And part of what you should be thinking about with that is how close do you need to be to and from your subject. I was too close with this one, but this landscape came out much nicer, especially when it's cropped. You can see the little waterfall in here. Well, I don't know if you can through this recording, but it makes a much more interesting picture. Okay, the second method, the Brennheiser method, is one where you are doing a portrait on purpose, and we're going to use a long focal length, somewhere around a 85 if we have one, but basically zoomed all the way in if you just have a kit lens. And what we're going to do is we're going to start by taking a picture of the face, because that's the most important, and that's what we want to make sure is perfectly sharp. So we zoom in, and if you remember right, there's 3 things that affect depth of field. This is all about making a shallow depth of field. Okay, so aperture, our camera to subject distance, and our zoom are our 3 things that affect depth of field. We're going to set our aperture to be the lowest number, largest opening we have possible. So that's usually like a 4 or 5.6. And then we're going to zoom in. So we're going to be at least zoomed in all the way if we have a kit lens, or around 85. You could even go higher with this, and that would be fine. But we're going to crop relatively so that we have their whole head in the frame, but not a whole lot more. And so we start by taking a picture of the face, and then we move around. And this is just a sort of suggested pattern for this image, but we're making sure there's a good amount of overlap. So about 1/3 of the frame overlap between frame 1 and frame 2. And we're sort of, this is something you can handhold and do, but you just have to be very, cautious about it. Make sure that you're overlapping enough. Better to overlap more with your frames than not enough, because it won't be able to find them and stitch them together if there's only a little bit. So anyway, we move around, essentially creating this overall composition, and then this is what the final frame looks like. So aperture, camera subject distance, we have to be a certain distance away in order to compose like that, but we're going to be zoomed in so that we're getting their whole head, but not a whole lot more. Okay, so that's what that usually looks like. Really, really small. What I'm trying to say, the circles of confusion are large, actually, or your bokeh is very noticeable. And that's all exaggerated because of this method. If you were to compose your frame like this, you're using a wider angle of view, which gives you more depth of field. So this is all about that shallow depth of field. And then the third method is this, where we are using this bracket that goes in the back of a view camera. And it'll let you shoot relatively 6 frames or more. You can see that there's a 1, 2, 3, or there's a 6, 4, 6, 4, 6, 4. And that's for if you have like a full frame versus a crop frame camera, or depending on the orientation of the camera. But basically you take at least 6 frames, lining up the center mark to 1, 2, and 3, then you flip over the whole bracket. And you can see how this circle is off-centered. So we do this top 3, we flip over the bracket, and then we do the bottom 3. Or depending on your orientation and everything, or your size of your sensor, we could do more. Okay, and so basically it gives you these perfectly aligned frames where the camera sensor is literally moving within the camera. It essentially is what it's doing. Now this one, we're kind of limited and we have to stay close to campus or on campus because it's a heavy piece of, it's a heavy camera that has to be on a big tripod. So we can take this around campus. We could photograph, and I should talk about subjects. This one could be architecture. This could be a landscape. This could be portraits even with this one. The idea of the Brennheiser method is that shallow depth of field for portraits. You could technically do like a sculpture or something like that, and still see that depth of field. But relatively, this should be a portrait. And then this first method could be anything. It could be a portrait, it could be landscape, it could be architecture. It should obviously be something, any of these should not be a portrait that's moving. You need to tell your model to stay as still as possible with any of these if you do that way. But this, you need to stay close to campus. This one you could easily do at home or anywhere, and same with this one. So that's why I'm sort of starting with these two that are the easiest. This one doesn't need as much explanation, I think, because you can kind of get the idea of making sure there's a little bit of overlap, and you can kind of photograph anything you want. This one we'll actually do a demo in class, and then this one's kind of like you have to do it with the equipment on campus. So I'm not going to dive into how to do this in Photoshop right now, because we'll do that on Tuesday. But I think that should answer, or it should give you a good idea of what you need to do. I can bring in examples. I think I have these files that I can give you to play with in class if you're not able to photograph before then. But I would try and do this as much as possible, like have images ready to go. Basically Tuesday we'll do this method. I'll demo how to do the whole Photoshop thing. And then if we have time, I might introduce the next one, but I'm thinking that we save the Brennheiser for Thursday, and then I'll save the one with the view camera to the following Tuesday. We'll see how much time we have. We might get ahead so you have more time to edit, but that's sort of my plan for now. So let me know if you have any questions, and just start photographing if you have the time. I mean, over the weekend is usually the best, right? All right, let me know what questions you have.